Get comfortable, let the room grow quiet, and allow the night to settle around you. This is a story based on true events, and it is gently fictionalized through my eyes. I am Margaret Ellen Harrow, a reporter who lived and worked in Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. If you like the way I tell this tale, please subscribe and like the channel. If you have a moment, leave a quiet note in the comments telling me where you're listening from, what time it is where you are, or which cold case you might like to hear next. Take a deep breath and let your mind wander as I place a few names and places on the table. I will return to them slowly as the story unfolds, steady and calm. Character Bible. The people you will meet as I remember them. Margaret Ellen Harrow. I am the narrator. In December 1968, I was 27 years old, a staff reporter at the Vallejo Times-Herald. I lived in a small rented house not far from the Murray Island Strait in Vallejo, and I often walked home under fog-lit streets after late nights at the newsroom. I am patient, curious, and easily made tired by long stretches of unanswered questions. William Bill Carmichael, my editor at the Vallejo Times-Herald. He was in his late 40s then, practical, steady-handed with the newsroom's anxieties. He trusted me with late-night beats and the telephone that never stopped ringing. Thomas Tom Ruiz, our photographer in his early 30s. Tom had a soft laugh and an eye for light. He would follow me to quiet places and always wait with his camera. A quiet presence when we spoke with people who had lived through something they could not yet name. Detective David Toshi, a well-known investigator from San Francisco, later to be associated in the papers with the case. A thoughtful, steady man who worked long hours with a face that never quite let you know what he was thinking. I saw him at briefings, and he sometimes stopped by our office with news or a guarded question. David Arthur Faraday, age 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, age 16. Young people from the Vallejo area. Their full names are the first names this story must remember. They were the first known victims linked in the sequence we would later call by a single, chilling name. Darlene Elizabeth Ferrin, age 22, and Michael Renaud Majot, age 19. People I would learn about as the case unfolded in July 1969. Their names spoken across radio static and coffee cups in the newsroom. Brian Hartnell, age 20, and Cecilia Ann Shepherd, age 22. A couple who were at Lake Berryessa in late September 1969. Their afternoon became part of a path that stretched from lonely roads to city streets. Paul Lee Stein, age 29. A San Francisco taxi driver whose name would be read in the same breath as the others after an October night in 1969. Arthur Lee Allen, a man who would later be named by investigators and reporters as a subject of focus. He was a figure in the years to come, described by some as a plausible suspect, by others as an imperfect fit. He died in 1992, and through my telling I will explain why nothing was ever proven beyond doubt. Donald and Betty Harden, private citizens, a teacher and his wife, who helped solve an early cipher sent to the newspapers. Their calm, patient work was a reminder that sometimes answers come from quiet minds working together. Location details you should picture. Vallejo and Benicia along the Carquinez Strait. Fog that moves like a slow curtain. Lovers' lanes with small pullouts and the soft glow of dashboard lights. Blue Rock Springs Park sits in Vallejo with its gentle hills and picnic spots. Lake Herman Road, a winter stretch of asphalt and pines where one December night felt like a beginning. Lake Berryessa, in Napa County. An open sense of space on summer afternoons. The Presidio Heights neighborhood in San Francisco, where city lights press against the hills and taxis thread the narrow streets. These places, and the seasons that held them, winter of 1968, summer of 1969, the early autumn of 1969, will come up as we move slowly through time. Before the fear settled in, Northern California felt as it always had to me, open-hearted and oddly small. Young couples drove to quiet pullouts to talk, to listen to the radio under the dark, to share a cigarette or a laugh. My routine was shaped by those small, ordinary rhythms. I would rise to the hiss of the kettle, drink too much coffee, shuffle through the paper's copy and the county's morning bulletins. In the evening, I would return to a newsroom lit by a single lamp, the typewriter tapping like a heartbeat, a rotary phone that might ring to call me to something unexpected. Take a deep breath now. Let the quiet settle. Imagine the hush of a foggy morning and the slow, careful way a small town moves through its day. I remember how safe those roads felt. I remember the smell of wet pavement and the sound of tires on Highway 29 as the sun rose over Mare Island. There was an ease to it, a trust that people knew where they could leave their cars and their doors unlocked. And yet, in that ease, even then, there was the gentle hint of something watchful, the kind of feeling you do not name until you have to. We will move forward slowly. I will tell you the first time the silence was broken and how I learned, over late nights and soft phone calls, that everything had changed. But that's a story for the next chapter. Take a deep breath and keep the room soft and warm around you. Let your shoulders drop as you listen. In the last chapter, I placed names and places gently on the table. Tonight, I will return to those people and to the neighborhoods where they lived, and I will tell you about the ordinary lives that met under a sky both clear and sometimes fog-soft. When I think of Vallejo in the winter of 1968, I think first of small gestures. A neighbor returning a borrowed cup. Teenagers sneaking to the lake with a transistor radio for company. The hush at the diner just before midnight when the cook flipped the last hash browns onto a plate. I remember Benicia across the water with its sweet little main street and the evenings when the tide changed the shape of everything. These were ordinary towns, enough space for privacy, enough sameness for people to expect that strangers were strangers and friends were known faces at the grocery store. Who were the people I knew then, and how did they move through their days? My friend Tom Ruiz, for example, had a habit of taking photographs of people while they were thinking, not posing. He liked to tell me that photographs were best when the subject forgot the camera was there. Bill Carmichael, the editor, liked small details. He could coax a whole human life into a paragraph if he had to, and he trusted me to bring him those details without fanfare. There were high school dances at which young people laughed too loudly, and there were lake afternoons where couples parked along Lake Herman Road and watched the water. Lovers' lanes, notorious only because they were private in the way that young love is private, were not places anyone expected trouble. They were places to whisper, to listen to the AM radio, to promise small things to one another. Those places were part of the texture of the neighborhoods. Blue Rock Springs Park with its day-use areas and gentle rise. Quiet residential streets where porch lights burned late into the night. I often wrote small columns about these things. I wrote of a woman who ran a sandwich shop on Georgia Street, of a librarian who kept a steady hand over the children's reading hour. When the nights were quiet, I would walk home past rows of houses, the light from a television flickering through curtains, and I would think about how simple the world seemed then. Did I, or did anyone else, sense the shift coming? Perhaps, in retrospect, we can see the first threads, the tiny alterations to the pattern. But at the time, the rhythms continued. People parked at the lake. Couples sat in cars and smoked. There were late-night drives to the bridge. The feeling of safety was not fragile, so much as assumed. I remember, one spring evening in 1969, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, when Tom came by with photographs he had taken earlier that day of Blue Rock Springs. He set them down gently. We looked at faces of people who were strangers to us now, and might, in time, mean much more. "Do you ever think about what a place remembers?" Tom asked. It was a question I kept returning to. Places keep the echoes of conversations and the sound of doors closing. They remember weather and footsteps. I did not realize then that they would remember other things too. Among the people I began to know better were the families of these young couples. I learned the voice of Mrs. Jensen when she called in to ask about community notices. I wrote once about Mr. Faraday trimming roses in his front yard. He had a way of whistling while he worked. These small impressions are what I returned to in my notes, because I believed, as many of us did, that a life is mostly small, beautiful moments stitched together. And then the calls came more often. Not many at first, but enough to disturb the rhythm. Police blotters that had once read like lists of traffic citations began to contain words we did not like to speak aloud in the newsroom. Words like found and investigation and seen. We had not yet learned to fold those words into our days without a kind of stitch in the throat. I would go out now and then for small assignments, and people would look at me with a careful interest, like someone who was trying to measure how much to tell. Mothers would say, "Be careful, Margaret," in that low voice all mothers have. Men in the hardware store would stop and ask after the copy that I was working on. In my notebooks I wrote details. A jacket hung on the back of a chair, a child's bike on its side in the yard, a incandescent porch light that had been left on through the night. These were the markers of ordinary things, but ordinary things meet unusual events. That meeting can be abrupt, or it can be a slow slide. We would find out how slow a slide could be, how odd the small moments would feel once something new had moved into the air. Before I tell you about the first night that changed our idea of safety, breathe slowly with me. Let the hum of the ceiling fan become a steady metronome. Let your eyes soften. Imagine the small towns of the Carquinez Strait, the light on the water, the pull of the shoreline, the hush over the picnic tables, when no one is there but the wind. That is the place we return to, and it is from there that everything else will start. I will tell you next about that first night on Lake Herman Road and the way the newsroom's phone rang and rang, but that's a story for the next chapter. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders unclench and listen to my voice as if I am in the room with you. In the last chapter, I talked about small towns and small habits. Now, I will tell you how one winter night in 1968 altered the map of what seemed ordinary. It was December 20th, 1968. I remember the date because I have it written in my notebook in my own hurried hand, and because the calendar in the newsroom had a little coffee ring at the corner where it had been handled too many times. That night, I was in the office later than usual, finishing a piece on winter traffic safety. The city was in a hush, and the printer's lights were still on down the hall. The call came in on the newsroom's teletype, a terse line of words that had a gravity I could not at first place. Possible shooting, Lake Herman Road, For a moment, I thought it was an accident. We were used to car crashes and sometimes to domestic arguments that spilled into the police blotter. Tom and I grabbed our coats. Bill Carmichael's voice was steady on the phone as he told me to go, to take notes and listen. "Be careful, Maggie," he said. Those words were small then, and I nodded though he could not see it. When we arrived at Lake Herman Road that evening, the air was close between the trees, the headlights of squad cars looking like watchful eyes. Police tape held a quiet crowd back. The scene officers were polite, professional, and they moved with that practiced calm I have come to associate with people who do difficult work night after night. I learned the victims' names soon after the first official reports. David Arthur Faraday, age 17. Betty Lou Jensen, age 16. Two young people whose names I had heard in high school brackets and at weekend gatherings. I remember the way officers said their names slowly, with a care that was almost gentle. The paper would fill the next day with the facts, the quotes from family members, the kind of concise chronology the newsroom knows how to produce. It is what we did. We told what had happened with respect and clarity. There was confusion at first. Witnesses were few, and the road that night was sparsely travelled. The patrol officers put out a call, and soon the county investigators were there with their clipboards. In the flicker of emergency lights, I watched people I had known in ordinary contexts become participants in an investigation. Neighbours were questioned gently in their pyjamas. Mothers were led into warm cars to wait. I sat in my car at the edge of the scene and made notes. I wrote what I could see. The hush of the pines, the dampness on the road, the way the radio sounded under the hum of the police helicopters. It was the same place where, weeks earlier, a couple had gone to listen to a lake and share secrets in the dark. It was the same pullout, and it had the same sky. Only the quiet had become different somehow. It felt like a library where someone had just closed the wrong book too loudly. When I returned to the office that night, I felt oddly raw with fatigue and with a new, thin worry. I wrote the piece with my hands shaking a little, not because of what I wrote so much as because of the way ordinary lives had been shown suddenly to be vulnerable in a way we had not counted on. The piece went to print the next morning. In the newsroom, people asked quiet, careful questions. We worked the phones and made the calls that were necessary. We tried to be useful in small and respectful ways. Was this a random act? Was it an isolated tragedy? Those were the questions people asked, including me. The idea that two young people might be lost in a place where we had once felt safe seemed irrelevant until we had to accept that it was possible. In those first days there were suggestions of accident, of misadventure, of the worst kinds of misfortune. The investigators tried to weigh all possibilities. The days afterward blurred in a way that felt like bad weather, grey skies, many interviews. The kind of paperwork that piles up and which, somehow, takes on its own momentum. The next weeks were full of small phone calls from people who remembered something, who had seen something, who were sure they had heard something. I called families and asked them to tell me, in their own time, what they wanted the town to know. I recorded details, an old photograph of a young man in a plaid shirt, a mother who could not stop straightening a folded towel as she spoke. These are the kinds of things reporters collect when the world changes and people need to tell their stories. At the time, we did not know that this night would be read later as a beginning of a pattern. In that first slow week, the idea of patterns seemed remote, like a possibility that might be written by a careful, distant mind. All we knew then was that a life had been interrupted, and that the routines of a town had been rearranged, slightly and surely. Let your breath slow now. Take in another easy breath, and picture again the hush of the pines along Lake Herman Road. Imagine the newsroom lamp where I sat and began to make lists of names and numbers. The world had not yet learned its new vocabulary for such things. There would be another night that summer that would lead us to ask different questions, and the word pattern would begin to appear in conversations where it had not before. But that's a story for the next chapter. Take a slow breath and let your hands rest by your sides. In the last chapter, I told you about Lake Herman Road on December 20th, 1968, and the way the newsroom felt in the days after. We began to learn the edges of a troubling picture then, and now I will tell you about how the work of investigation unfolded when another night, months later, added to our questions. It was July 4th, 1969. The air smelled faintly of barbecue and gunpowder from fireworks that had been set off earlier in the day. I remember the ease of that morning, moving from a lighter mood to a more dutiful one as the calls began to come in. Blue Rock Springs Park is a place people go for picnics and for quiet views. That afternoon, it became a point of focus for the county and the newspaper alike. We learned that evening of injuries at Blue Rock Springs. Darlene Elizabeth Ferrin, age 22, and Michael Reno Major, age 19, were found there. Michael survived, and he later became a vital witness. At the time of that call, I had the feeling, almost like a bruise, that had started to form weeks earlier at Lake Herman Road. The call was less a shock than a confirmation that some difficult work was ahead. Police response came quickly. The Vallejo Police Department worked alongside the Solano County investigators. Different jurisdictions met at the scene: city officers, county detectives, and later, when the threads widened, investigators from San Francisco. That patchwork of authority is important to understand. In the Bay Area, little threads of responsibility can overlap. A single stretch of road might be of interest to more than one agency, and that means that communication becomes as important as evidence itself. We learned this the hard way. At the newsroom, the teletype stammered across long lines of print as we tried to assemble the simple, reliable facts. Reporters called family members. Tom brought photographs back from the scene. Detectives called to offer cautious statements. I wrote the early copy with an attention to restraint, because we needed people to be able to read the news without panic. We needed names to be spoken and facts to be recorded. Was there a thread between Blue Rock Springs and Lake Herman Road? At first, it was only a question. Both places were quiet in their own ways, a lover's lane and a park, and both had been the setting for things that were, at the time, nearly unimaginable. Michael Major's survival would later provide details that investigators used to build a picture. He remembered parts of the vehicle, a partial license plate, and other fragments that can sometimes be more useful than they feel in the moment. As the days moved on, investigators began to talk about pattern with a new seriousness. They compared bullet trajectories, the time of night, and the seemingly random nature of the attacks. Detectives in Vallejo worked with county officials, and they sometimes slowed as they negotiated who would lead which piece of work. This threaded the story with a kind of administrative exhaustion, the sort of fatigue that comes from long nights of coordination. I sat in briefings from time to time, notebook in hand. I remember Detective David Toshi being methodical, asking questions as if he were laying out chess pieces. He and other investigators preferred to work from small, verified facts. But this case carried a new element, a level of public concern that made everything louder. People wanted answers, and the press wanted to provide them without adding to alarm. We were limited by the tools of the time. Forensics had not yet learned the techniques that would arrive in later decades. There was no DNA testing as we know it now. Investigators relied on fingerprints, ballistic comparisons, and the kind of careful physical observation that could be painfully slow. Evidence collection had to be meticulous. Paper records were the backbone of the case. Files stacked into manila folders, and the newsroom's copy desk leaned on the same information that detectives did. It was in those months that the case began to feel less like isolated tragedies and more like a network of possibilities. I remember vividly the moment when I first realized that this was not only an investigatory exercise, but a kind of collective holding of breath. The town watched the police as much as the police watched the town. Phone calls increased in number. People would show up at the newsroom with small items, a memory of a license plate, a scrap of clothing, or a story told in a voice that trembled at the edges. Through it all, I felt a growing fatigue, a steady exhaustion of attention that I had not known before. Days bled into nights, and the rhythm of my work changed. I found myself walking home later and later, with the fog pressing close and the headlights of distant cars carving thin columns through the mist. I would sit alone at the kitchen table and reread my notes until the words blurred. Does that sound obsessive? Maybe it was. But part of the job, then as now, is to keep returning to a question until it answers itself, or until what is left is only patience. As investigators compared their notes, and as our newsroom tried to assemble a coherent picture, no single explanation stood out. That was the hardest part, the not knowing that would not fully settle. There would be another attack in September, and that time I would be nearer to the center of the story. But for now, we worked the facts we had, and we watched as the town held its breath. Take another quiet breath. Let the sound of my voice be a steady presence. I will tell you about September and Lake Berryessa next, about a day under an open sky and the hooded figure that we later read about in the papers, but gently, calmly, without adding anything sharper than the recorded facts. But that's a story for the next chapter. Take a long, slow breath and imagine the newsroom with papers spread across desks, coffee gone cool in chipped mugs, and the radio that sometimes offered only static. In the previous chapter, we were talking about the ways investigators began to compare details between Blue Rock Springs and Lake Herman Road. Now I will talk about another kind of evidence that arrived in our laps, not on the ground, but in the mail. It was in the summer of 1969, in the weeks after Blue Rock Springs, that envelopes began to appear at newspaper offices. The first ones arrived at the Vallejo Times-Herald, and then similar envelopes were received by other Bay Area papers. I remember the first time one came into our office. Its edges were neat, the paper heavy enough to be slightly resisting when you opened it. Inside was a letter, written in a careful, clipped hand, and alongside it, a series of strange characters arranged in a way I had only seen in puzzles as a child. You could feel the particular steadiness of the person who sent it, the sort of control that came through in the way the words were placed on the page. It was neither messy nor hurried. It was deliberate. There was also a symbol, a circle with intersecting lines, that would come to be recognized by many as the sign used in the letters. The envelope was postmarked. The handwriting suggested someone who had thought carefully about their message. Don and Betty Harden, a teacher, and his wife in California, would later help solve one of the ciphers that came with the letters. I remember the day we reported their work. They had taken what looked like meaningless characters and turned them into plain sentences. Their patient, methodical approach helped us all understand that the letters were not just taunting notes, they were puzzles. They were invitations to a particular kind of attention. The letters called themselves by a name that would quickly stick in public conversation: Zodiac. The writer appended the cross-circle symbol and signed the note with that word in some messages. A sense of identity arrived with the letters, a chosen name and a chosen symbol. In the office, Bill and I discussed whether to publish the full text. We decided to report the essential parts carefully, to provide readers with what they needed to know without amplifying the parts that might cause panic. There were taunts and threats in some of these pages, phrased in a way that was clinical and composed. The tone of the letters often surprised me, part casual observation, part bizarre game. It was clear they were calculated to attract attention, to test the reach of the newspapers, and to put certain details into the public record. I handled some of these letters myself, turning the envelopes over in my gloved hands at the copy desk, noting the stamp, the way the paper had soaked up ink at the corner. For a reporter, these physical objects become items to be catalogued, date received, to whom it was addressed, whether there were fingerprints or other marks. We produced stories that described the letters and their ciphers. Some readers were fascinated and wrote to our office offering to help decipher codes. Others were frightened and asked what it meant for their children and for the quiet places they knew. The newspapers worked to strike a balance, to keep the public informed while not inflaming fear. That balance felt delicate, like carrying a tray of glasses across a crowded room. Did the letters change the investigation? Yes, in a way that is subtle and broad. They moved some of the focus from purely local officers to a broader conversation about motive, identity, and publicity. Detectives of different jurisdictions began to compare not only physical evidence, but the language of the letters, the handwriting, the stamps. The fact that a writer had given themselves a name and embraced a symbol created a public persona that would, over time, confound and complicate the work of police and reporters alike. The ciphers themselves were a kind of mirror. What you saw in them was partly what you brought. For some of us, the presence of a puzzle offered a sliver of controlled distance. You could study a cipher like a jigsaw and feel temporarily removed from the grief and the fear. For others in the town, every new envelope was an unwelcome reminder that the person who sent it could be near or far, could be watching the papers, could be reading a paragraph of their own composition written in the same quiet room where you have your morning coffee. There were nights when I sat at my kitchen table and traced characters with my finger, thinking of the people who would hold such a puzzle and imagine something else entirely. I grew weary in a new way, not only from the long hours of reporting, but from the sense of being pulled into a conversation that had no end. Sometimes I woke with the letters' symbols in my head, the cross circle floating like a sun. Let your breath settle now. Picture the copy desk, the soft clack of typewriter keys, the envelope with its spare, deliberate handwriting. The months following would bring more letters and more ciphers, some solved, others left puzzling for years. And as the investigators wrestled with these words, the case would take on more texture and a broader purview, stretching across counties and into the city itself. There would be another afternoon in late September when the investigator's path would lead to Lake Berryessa, and there the persona, in the letters, would take on a particular shape. But that's a story for the next chapter. Take a slow, steady breath. Let the sound of my voice be the pillow beneath your thoughts as I guide you through another part of this long story. In the previous chapter, I described the letters, the symbols, and the way they arrived at our desks. Now I will tell you about a day at Lake Berryessa, and then about a night in San Francisco, both of which broaden the map of where investigators looked and how the case felt to those of us who watched and wrote. September 27, 1969, was a late summer day with a softness to the light. Lake Berryessa is wide and open, and when I think back to that afternoon, I remember a sense of breadth. The couple who were there, Brian Hartnell, age 20, and Cecilia Ann Shepard, age 22, had chosen the lake for a quiet outing. It was an ordinary plan, a picnic by the water, a conversation away from the hum of town. What happened that afternoon would be described in many accounts, and investigators would later place it into the broader sequence of events. I will only say what I know from my notes and from the public record, and I will keep the telling simple. A person approached wearing a hooded outfit and a symbol that matched the one we had seen in the letters. The costume included a covering for the head, bearing the cross-circle mark. At our newspaper, someone described it later as a strange, deliberate theatricality, a kind of dress that was meant to be noticed. The details of what the survivors told authorities were catalogued with the clinical patience of investigators who needed precision. Brian Hartnell's recollections were later essential in providing what pieces of memory that the police could follow. The presence of the symbol drew a line between the letters and this event that was difficult to ignore. The lake, which had been a place for quiet afternoons, became a place that investigators visited over and over, filing reports and comparing notes. A few weeks later, on October 11th, 1969, another event shifted the horizon. Paul Lee Stein, age 29, a taxi driver in San Francisco, was killed in a neighborhood called Presidio Heights. A taxi cab is a small world, a driver, a passenger, a route through the city. The news of his death traveled quickly through the radio and through the newsroom. When a letter arrived at a newspaper claiming responsibility for the killing and including a small item of proof, the public's attention sharpened. That letter, and the item that came with it, connected a murder in the city to the wider pattern that investigators were tracing. The person who signed as Zodiac wrote in a voice that the public read with a mixture of fright and curiosity. The symbol was there again, the cross circle marking the pages. For the investigators, it raised hard questions about motive and reach. Had the same person acted in town and in the country? Were these acts linked by more than the symbol? What I remember in those weeks was not only the facts, but the mood that moved through the newsroom like a changing weather pattern. Phone calls increased. Reporters who did not usually cover crime found themselves reordered into the work by necessity. Detectives across Vallejo, Solano County, Napa County, and San Francisco compared notes. And that interagency communication began to be both essential and occasionally frustrating. Different departments had their own procedures and their own pressures. It is a natural thing in an area with as many municipal boundaries as ours. The lines of jurisdiction can sometimes feel like fences at a picnic table. We had no forensic DNA testing then, as we would know it later. We had fingerprints, we had eyewitness testimony, and we had ballistic comparisons when bullets could be matched. We relied on photographs, on witness statements taken under bright lamps and measured carefully. Some evidence was physical, some evidence was language. The letters were a kind of evidence certainly, handwriting, postmarks, phrasing, and that resolute symbol. The investigators treated them as more than mere publicity stunts. I remember becoming exhausted in a new way. It was not only the long hours, but the steady attention to small details that age you quietly. Nights slid into mornings. I would go home and sit in the dark with our cat, the house quiet, while the events of the day looped through my head like a film I could not quite turn off. Sometimes I would find simple solace in small rituals, washing my face, making tea, writing a note to myself to remember to file something the next day. Did the letters guide the investigation, or did they distract from it? That is a fair question, and one the investigators discussed in private and in public. Some of the letters contained details that could only have come from the person who wrote them, if they truly were at the scenes. Others seemed to offer a performance of self. The ambiguity in the letters became part of the puzzle. The investigations often felt like a weaving of both kinds of evidence. As I sat with my notes and my photographs, the shape of the work narrowed and widened day by day. Some leads seemed promising and faded. Today, when I look back, I think of those weeks as a time of intense, careful effort under a sky that refused to be anything other than patient. The people we wrote about, the families, the investigators, the town, all move forward one day at a time. Let your breath settle into an even rhythm. Picture a quiet lakeshore, and then a city street where a taxi passes beneath a streetlight. The geography of this case stretched from quiet country places into the heart of the city, and somewhere between those two kinds of places, the letters and the symbol drew lines that the investigators would follow for years. There were more letters to come, and more nights that felt like small awakenings. But that's a story for the next chapter. Take a gentle breath and let your eyes soften. We have walked through names and places, letters and scenes, and now we come to the long, slow work of trying to make sense of what we had. In the months and years after 1969, investigators and the press looked for a truth that was often elusive. I will tell you how one name came into focus, and why, despite that focus, certainty never quite arrived. After the attacks and the arrival of the letters, detectives began to follow a number of leads. The work was methodical and often exhausting. In the Vallejo and San Francisco offices, detectives compared handwriting samples, followed partial license plates, and revisited witnesses. The investigators interviewed people hours on end, returning to the same questions because any detail might matter. One name that surfaced prominently in conversations and in some investigative notes was Arthur Lee Allen. He was described in files and in the press as a man who had caught the attention of certain investigators. He was in his mid-30s at the time and would later be called a primary suspect by some. I will name him here because his name appears in many public records, and because it is important to explain how investigators worked through both suspicion and uncertainty. What brought attention to Arthur Lee Allen were a combination of circumstantial items and some statements from people who knew him. Some investigators felt there were connections in his background and behavior that warranted closer scrutiny. There were searches, interviews, examinations of personal papers, and remarks by colleagues and acquaintances that added to a portrait that was, at first glance, compelling in places. But a portrait made of fragments is still only fragments. The tools available at the time were limited. Forensic science had not yet gained the capabilities it would in later decades. Fingerprints, the analysis of handwriting, and other physical comparisons were used, but they can be less conclusive than modern DNA testing. In Arthur Lee Allen's case, Despite sustained attention from both official investigators and private detectives, nothing definitive connected him to the letters and to the crimes in a way that would survive the scrutiny of court or final determination. He remained a person of interest, and later, after his death in 1992, debate would continue in the press and among enthusiasts about how to interpret the evidence. It is important to say, quietly and plainly, that suspicion is not proof. The law recognizes that distinction, which is why investigative work must be cautious. Investigators will often speak of degrees of certainty and of the difference between a compelling theory and a demonstrable fact. In this case, no single theory reached the point where all investigators agreed and where it could stand as a definitive solution. There were other names that came up over time as amateur sleuths, private investigators, and journalists sifted through evidence and theories. Some of those names appeared in print, and others only in the margins of files. Many times the motivation for naming someone was not to accuse unjustly, but to explore a lead. The process of investigating such a case is, unavoidably, a process of making hypotheses and testing them, and sometimes those tests produce only further questions. What left many of us exhausted was not only that no one definitive answer appeared, but that the public conversation kept reopening old wounds. Families read stories, and each new line of speculation could feel like a reopening. That is why I came to value restraint in reporting. It is a matter of respect for the people whose lives are entangled with a case. Internally, the police felt frustration too. They were hampered by jurisdictional hurdles, by limited forensic methods, and by a public appetite for immediate results. Investigators worked nights and weekends. They followed up on leads that at first blush seemed promising, and then were forced to put them aside. They kept files in manila folders, they took statements on long pads of paper, and they stared at maps until the roads began to spin. In my notebook, I wrote both the names and the moods of the people involved. I wrote that investigators were humane and tired. I wrote that families adapted in various ways. Some withdrew from public life, others spoke out, and some found solace in quiet routines. The community learned slowly that an answer might not come in time to bring back what had been lost. That is a lesson in a world that often expects a tidy resolution. Take a quiet breath now and imagine the stacked manila folders, the careful handwriting of detectives, the evening lamps in the police precincts. The truth, in this case, did not emerge in a single moment. It emerged as a set of careful observations that produced more possibilities than finalities. Names like Arthur Lee Allen stayed in the record, but the record itself did not become a closed book. There would be years of correspondence, of new theories, and of cultural interest that kept the story alive long after the last letter was received. But why the certainty was never reached? That is a story of limited tools, conflicting witness accounts, disparate jurisdictions, and the human difficulty of proving what sometimes only feels true to some and not to others. We will go next to how the letters tapered and what legacy the case left in police work and in the wider culture. But that's a story for the next chapter. Take a gentle breath and let the day wash out from behind your eyes. In the chapters before this one, I have told you about the crimes, the letters, and the people who search for answers. Now we move into the years when the public interest stayed steady, but the direct communications, the letters and the envelopes began to thin. The writer who called themselves Zodiac continued to send letters through the early 1970s. They came to several newspapers and to law enforcement offices in fits and starts. Some were mailed with ciphers and symbols. Some were simply short notes with a signature mark. Each arrival renewed public conversation and police attention. Each envelope arrived like a small weather event, bringing with it questions and a stir of activity that would last for days. By the mid-1970s, the letters had become less frequent, and by 1974, the steady cadence of mailed taunts had largely stopped. There was no single, conclusive ending to the correspondence. Rather, the communications tapered away, as if a hand that had been writing slowly lowered and rested. That quieting did not, however, resolve the uncertainties. Instead, the case settled into the category of the unsolved, a label that comes with its own weight. During those years, policing changed in small, significant ways. The nations of detectives who had worked on the case learned from their experience. Interagency communication became a more important conversation. The idea that a case could cross municipal lines and require a shared strategy began to be taken more seriously. People spoke of centralizing evidence reviews and of forming task forces that could bridge county borders. Those were practical, quiet improvements that grew out of the demands of a case that would not conform to one jurisdictional map. Forensics in the decade after these events began to evolve as well. New techniques, new equipment, and new ways of preserving evidence slowly entered the vocabulary of investigators. I remember listening to detectives describe how different the tools might be a decade or two later, how DNA testing could answer questions that, in 1969, had to be left unanswered. For the families and for the town, such talk was a promise that future methods might help, but it was also a reminder that the time in which events occurred was a time of real limitations. The public remained engaged. Books were written, television shows referenced the case, and the name Zodiac became part of the cultural landscape. People who had been ordinary neighbors found their stories recorded in national magazines and interviewed by distant reporters. There was an urge to understand and a hunger for resolution that grew with each retelling. This cultural fascination did not make the case easier for the people who had been directly affected by it. Sometimes it added another layer of headlines to the quiet work of grief and recovery. I kept writing about the cultural effects of the events, and I continued to file occasional pieces for the paper. My own life moved forward with ordinary changes. Friends married, colleagues retired, and the town altered in small ways. I grew older. In 1974, I was 33 years old, and the tasks of my days had shifted between family notices, editorial pieces, and the occasional revisit to the old files when a new letter or a new theory appeared. Why did the letters stop? We can only speculate with care. The pacing changed, perhaps, because the writer chose to stop. Perhaps their life circumstances changed. Perhaps the attention they sought had been achieved. Or perhaps there were reasons none of us could know. The stopping of letters left a silence that is itself a kind of remainder. Take one more slow breath now. Picture the town streets in the early morning, the fog lifting from the bay, the copy desk with its slow lamp. The years teach you how to live with a story that has no neat ending. That is not a dramatic lesson, but a steady one. Sometimes the best we can do is to keep records safe, to keep asking questions with respect, and to let new tools and new minds try again in time. In the next chapter, I will describe more about the lingering mysteries that remained after the letters faded, and about the ways the story affected policing, families, and the wider culture. But that's a story for the next chapter. Take a deep breath and allow the quiet to settle around you like a familiar blanket. We have walked through seasons and through files, through letters and through late-night phone calls. In this chapter, I will offer some gentle reflections on the aftermath, what changed, what did not, and how the case settled into an uneasy, enduring memory. The first thing to say is that the letters eventually stopping did not end the question of identity. People still asked who had written them and why. Families would sometimes write to the paper asking for privacy, and sometimes they would speak publicly about their loved ones and about the way the town had been reshaped. I heard those voices and tried always to be careful with them, to give them space and to keep their dignity in print. The case had long-term impacts on policing. In the decades after the 1960s, agencies examined how they could better communicate across lines and how evidence could be preserved for future analysis. Cold case units began to form in some places, with the express purpose of returning to files when technology or new information made it worth the effort. The idea of preserving envelopes or of photographing a scene more thoroughly took on new urgency. Those are quietly consequential changes that the public rarely sees, but they matter greatly in the slow work of justice. For the community, the legacy was complex. There was, of course, sorrow for what had been lost, the lives and futures that ended too soon. There was also an ongoing curiosity, sometimes bordering on obsession, in the wider culture. Books, films, and articles explored angles large and small. People revisited old interviews, compared notes, and sometimes carefully argued over the merit of a theory. That fascination can be double-edged. It keeps attention on those lost, but it can also reopen wounds that people want left mended. For me personally, the case settled into a quiet ache and a sustained interest. I continued to file occasional stories about developments. I kept the old manila folders, and I received letters from readers who had their own memories to share. There is a rhythm to living alongside an unresolved case. Moments of quiet, long stretches of ordinary life, and then, sometimes, a ripple when something new appears. Why was certainty never reached? There are many reasons. Limited tools at the time reduced the ability to make absolute connections. Witness accounts sometimes varied, as human memories tend to do. A detail remembered in one way on one day might be remembered differently months or years later. Jurisdictional boundaries complicated the centralization of evidence and hindered the ease of collaboration. And importantly, sometimes facts remain simply insufficient to tie a person incontrovertibly to actions. Investigative suspicion can point a way forward, but without proof, it cannot provide closure. There are unsolved ciphers that still occupy the attention of puzzle solvers and historians. In my time, some of these puzzle pieces remained in the boxes on our shelves. They were studied by interested minds who loved logic and codes, and they sometimes offered a sense of order in an otherwise disorderly world. But even when a cipher yields words, those words do not always close the circle of human accountability. Years later, as the fog lifts over the bay in the quiet brightness of morning, people still ask me about the case. I answer as best I can, with facts that were public, and with a careful reminder that speculation is a dangerous thing. I have told this story many times now, always with the same reservation: to honor the people who were harmed, to respect the work of investigators, and to keep the balance between curiosity and compassion. Let your breath move slowly now. Imagine the old manila folders, the photographs, the lamp on my desk, a kettle that has been left to cool. Picture the towns along the Carquinez Strait with their porches and their quiet roads. Feel the fog lifting a gentle movement that reveals the day. The case remains a part of the landscape, a set of names and dates and unanswered questions. Yet life in the towns continued. People married and aged, grandchildren were born, and routine reclaimed much of the ordinary space that grief had once occupied. The cultural fascination with the case persists, but in the places directly affected the memory of those ordinary lives is the thing most people wish not to lose. I will tell you, in our last chapter, about what it feels like to leave the desk lamp on and to step outside into a bay morning, and about the soft, unresolved calm that remains. But that's a story for the next chapter. Take one final slow breath and let your eyelids lower if they wish. In the last chapter, I reflected on the aftermath, the changes, and the ways time softened some edges, but left others raw. Now, let us close this evening's passage through the story with a quiet, reflective ending. Fog lifts differently over the bay each morning. Sometimes it dissolves like a curtain drawn aside. Other times it retreats in wisps that make the distant hills look like watercolor. I remember walking along the Embarcadero in the hours just after dawn, the city still learning how to wake. I liked those hours because the world felt possible and kind, in a way that daytime sometimes could not be. As the years moved on, the files settled into boxes, and then into climate-controlled rooms, and the letters that had arrived so insistently found their place among records and memories. The name Zodiac remained in the papers and in the minds of people who followed the story. But for many of us who lived through the time, the lasting image is of families trying to go on and detectives doing the work they could, day by day. I still sometimes open the thin blue folder that holds my old notes. Nothing dramatic, just the edges of clipped articles, a few photographs, and the pads upon which I penciled quotes. There is a human rhythm to that quiet work. It is not the work of conclusion so much as the work of care. We try to keep memory accurate and do not trample on the lives of those who are grieving. The questions that remain are many, and they will remain for as long as there are people who puzzle through history and police through archives. Why did the letters begin and then stop? Why did some leads look more plausible than others? Why was no single conclusion reached? Those questions have answers that are partial and provisional. Imperfect tools, conflicting recollections, jurisdictional gaps, and the simple fact that human certainty is often elusive. Yet even with the questions left in place, there is a kind of calm that comes with time. The streets are quieter at night than they used to be in my anxious youth. The lovers who park by the quiet lakes still talk and sometimes laugh. The towns have kept their small mercies. People still greet one another at the hardware store. Grief has become part of the town's story, but it is not the only part. There is an odd tenderness to living with unanswered things. It reminds you to be kinder in small ways, to listen more closely, to hold a conversation with less hurry, to give a person the space they need to speak. I learned to do that work as a reporter, and I carried it with me after I left the newsroom. I learned that it is a kindness to avoid speculation when it harms, and a duty to preserve the record for those who might want to study it later. Take a deep, gentle breath now. Imagine the fog lifting over the bay, the soft light finding familiar roofs, the streets almost empty, except for the occasional early walker. Picture a desk with papers spread across it and a radio on low playing a song that has no urgency. Think of the names again. David Arthur Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Elizabeth Ferrin, Michael Renaud Mageau, Brian Hartnell, Cecilia Ann Shepard, and Paul Lee Stein. and the families who still keep them in memory. There are still unsolved ciphers and unresolved threads. There are still people who will sit with those pages late into the night, turning each line carefully. That is part of why the story endures. It stays alive because people keep asking, in calm and patient ways, for clarity and for truth. As you drift, know this. In the small towns and in the city, the streets have softened. There is an unresolved calm, a kind of holding, in which the day-to-day acts of kindness and decency persist. The lamp on my old desk still seems to have a warmth about it when I think of it, and sometimes I imagine it still casting a small pool of light in which someone might find the courage to keep working at the edges of a difficult question. Let your breathing fall into a slow rhythm. Allow the names and the places to float away like the last of the fog. The questions will remain, gentle and persistent. But for now, let the night be kind. Good night and sweet dreams.